On the night before Thanksgiving, 1971, a man in a business suit walked off a commercial airliner traveling 200 miles an hour, 10,000 feet above a Washington forest, wearing a parachute and carrying $200,000 in cash. He was never seen again. Not his body, not his parachute, not, to this day, his real name. This is the only unsolved hijacking in American aviation history. He bought his ticket with cash, under a name that turned out to be fake, and sat quietly in seat 18C, drinking a bourbon and soda. Then he handed a note to the flight attendant. It read in part, "I have a bomb." 90 minutes later, with $200,000 strapped to his body, he opened the rear door of a Boeing 727 in mid-flight and stepped out into a storm. The FBI investigated for 45 years. They never found him. To understand how a man simply vanished out of the sky, you have to start with how ordinary the whole thing looked at first. On November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, one of the busiest travel days of the year, a man walked up to the Northwest Orient Airlines counter at Portland International Airport and bought a one-way ticket to Seattle. He paid in cash, $20, and gave his name as Dan Cooper. He was in his mid-40s, medium build, wearing a dark suit, a white shirt, a black tie, and sunglasses. He carried a briefcase and an ordinary paper bag. Nothing about him drew a second look. Airport security in 1971 barely existed in the way we understand it today. No metal detectors, no ID checks, nothing stopping a man from carrying almost anything onto a plane. He boarded Flight 305, a short 30-minute hop to Seattle, and took his seat in the last row of the cabin, seat 18C, by himself. He ordered a bourbon and soda from the flight attendant, lit a cigarette, and waited for the plane to take off. To everyone around him, he looked like exactly what he appeared to be, a quiet businessman on a short domestic flight. Shortly after takeoff, he passed a note to a nearby flight attendant, Florence Schaffner. She assumed, at first, that it was a phone number, the kind of thing a lonely traveler slips a stewardess on a short flight, and dropped it into her pocket without reading it. Cooper leaned toward her and said quietly, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." She opened it. The note, later reconstructed from her memory since Cooper took it back, made his intentions clear. He wanted her to sit next to him. When she did, he opened his briefcase just enough for her to see the contents. A tangle of wires, a battery, and what looked like several red cylinders arranged in neat rows. Whether or not it was a real, functioning bomb has never been confirmed one way or another. It didn't need to be real. Everyone on that plane believed it was. Schaffner later described Cooper's manner as almost gentle throughout the entire encounter. He removed his sunglasses at one point, she recalled, and his eyes were brown and calm, not the eyes, she said, of a man who seemed afraid of what he was doing. He ordered another drink. He tipped the flight attendant for the first one. It was, by every account from everyone who dealt with him directly, one of the strangest hijackings anyone in the industry had ever witnessed, polite, methodical, and almost businesslike in its menace. Cooper's demands were specific and delivered calmly, without shouting or panic, a detail almost every crew member later remarked on. He wanted $200,000 in used $20 bills, non-sequential, unmarked. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve, in case, he said, they tried to force a novice along with him to jump as a hostage. And he wanted a fuel truck waiting when the plane landed in Seattle. The pilot radioed the demands ahead. Northwest Orient's president personally authorized the payoff without hesitation. The airline's policy, like most of the time, was full cooperation with hijackers, prioritizing passenger safety above all else. While the money and parachutes were being gathered on the ground, Cooper had the plane circle Puget Sound for nearly 2 hours, giving authorities time to prepare and giving himself time, presumably, to plan exactly what came next. When Flight 305 finally landed in Seattle, Cooper allowed all 36 passengers to leave the aircraft. In exchange, he received $200,000 in cash, packed into a bank bag, weighing around 20 pounds, and 4 parachutes. Only the flight crew remained on board. The pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant, a young woman named Tina Mucklow, whom Cooper kept with him in the cabin. His new demand was oddly specific for a hijacker with ostensibly nowhere fixed to go: fly to Mexico City. But the flight plan he insisted on was strange enough that the crew immediately understood something unusual was about to happen. He wanted the plane flown at a maximum altitude of 10,000 feet at the slowest safe speed, with the landing gear down, the wing flaps partially extended, and the cabin left unpressurized. These were not the specifications of a man planning to ride comfortably to Mexico. They were the specifications of a man planning to jump out of the plane while it was still in the air. The Boeing 727 Cooper had chosen was, in this one specific way, uniquely suited to what he had in mind. Unlike most commercial jets, the 727 had a rear air stair, a built-in staircase beneath the tail, foldable, that could technically be lowered while the aircraft was in flight. Almost no other passenger jet in the world could do this. Whoever Cooper really was, he seemed to know exactly which aircraft made his plan possible. The plane took off from Seattle just after 7:30 in the evening, climbing into a night thick with heavy rain and turbulence. Cooper instructed the remaining crew to stay in the cockpit, curtain drawn, and not to come out under any circumstances. Sometime after 8 o'clock, a warning light on the cockpit instrument panel flickered on, indicating that the rear air stair door had been opened. The crew called back through the intercom. There was no response. They continued flying the specified route toward Reno, Nevada, where they were scheduled to refuel. When the plane finally landed and the crew was able to check the cabin, it was empty. The money was gone. The parachutes, 2 of them at least, were gone. Cooper was gone. Somewhere over the dense, mountainous forest of southwestern Washington state, in the middle of a cold, rain-lashed November night, a man had walked backward down a fold-out staircase, off the back of a moving airliner, into open air, roughly 10,000 feet above the ground. Nobody on the plane felt him jump. No one saw a parachute open. The only evidence he had gone at all was an empty cabin and a slight, barely perceptible pressure bump the crew recalled feeling around 8:13 that night, later treated by investigators as the most likely moment of his exit. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in FBI history. Investigators, soldiers, and volunteers searched an enormous stretch of forest in southwestern Washington for weeks, and then for years. Helicopters swept the tree canopy. Ground teams combed the underbrush near the presumed drop zone. Divers searched nearby rivers and lakes. They found nothing: no parachute, no briefcase, no bones, no scrap of clothing, no trace that a man had ever come down out of that storm at all. Given the extreme cold, the difficulty of the terrain, and the violence of a nighttime jump into rain and near-freezing temperatures with an unfamiliar parachute rig, many investigators came to believe Cooper likely hadn't survived the landing, that his body was simply somewhere in that forest or that river system, never to be found. But belief wasn't proof, And as the years passed without a single piece of hard evidence, the case only grew stranger. The investigation itself became its own strange phenomenon. The FBI opened a file codenamed Norjack and, over the following decades, fielded thousands of tips from the public. Genuine leads mixed in with self-proclaimed psychics, amateur treasure hunters convinced they'd located the money through dreams, and no fewer than several hundred men who, at one point or another, confessed to being Cooper himself, none of whose stories ever held up under basic scrutiny. Search parties returned to the forest near the presumed drop zone summer after summer for years, funded partly by private citizens who had simply become obsessed with finding what the government could not. For 9 years, nothing changed. Then, in February of 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram was on a family picnic along the Columbia River, a sandy stretch of riverbank called Tenabar, when he began digging in the sand, the way children do, and uncovered several decaying, rubber-banded bundles of cash. It was later confirmed, bill by bill, using the serial numbers the FBI had recorded 9 years earlier. This was Cooper's ransom money. $5,880 of it, disintegrating in the sand along a riverbank, miles from where investigators believed he had jumped. It was the first, and to this day, the only piece of physical evidence ever recovered from the case. And instead of solving the mystery, it deepened it. How had the money traveled to that exact stretch of riverbank? Currents and flood patterns along the Columbia have been studied for decades since, without ever producing a clean answer. Had Cooper buried it there himself, before disappearing entirely on foot? Had it simply washed down from somewhere in the forest? Over years, following the river's slow, complicated path, the money raised as many questions as it answered, arguably more. In the decades since, dozens of named suspects have been proposed, investigated, and one by one, either cleared or left in frustrating, unresolved limbo. Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. carried out a strikingly similar hijacking just months later, demanding money and parachutes and jumping from a plane. But he had a documented alibi, placing him elsewhere on the night of the original hijacking. Kenneth Christensen, a former paratrooper and Northwest Orient employee, fit elements of the physical description and reportedly made a strange deathbed comment to his brother, but no direct evidence ever tied him to the crime. Dwayne Weber, a convicted felon, allegedly confessed to his wife on his own deathbed, saying simply, "I'm Dan Cooper," a claim that could never be independently verified after his death. Decades later, a woman named Marla Cooper told the FBI she believed her own uncle, a man named Lynn Doyle Cooper, was the hijacker, recalling a bloodied, exhausted man arriving at a family gathering the day after Thanksgiving in 1971, a memory investigators followed up on and ultimately could not confirm. And in more recent years, an amateur investigative team pointed toward a former Army officer named Robert Rackstraw, whose military parachute training and personal history matched the profile closely enough to become the subject of a national television documentary. Though Rackstraw himself denied it until his death in 2019, and the FBI never named him as a confirmed suspect either. None of these leads, or the dozens of others the FBI investigated over 4.5 decades, ever produced a conviction, a confession that held up, or a body. In 2016, 45 years after Cooper stepped off that staircase into the storm, the FBI formally announced it was suspending active investigation of the case. Not because it was solved, because after more agent hours than almost any case in the Bureau's history, there was simply nothing left to chase. The physical evidence that did exist, a black clip-on tie left behind on the plane, later analyzed for microscopic particles that hinted inconclusively at a background in aerospace manufacturing, was never enough, on its own, to name a single confirmed suspect. D.B. Cooper. The name itself the result of a simple wire service reporting error that stuck permanently in the public imagination, remains the only unsolved hijacking of a commercial aircraft in United States history. What he did changed the country in concrete, lasting ways. Within months, the FAA mandated a mechanical modification, still nicknamed the Cooper vane, that permanently prevents the rear air stairs on that model of aircraft from being lowered in flight. Broader airport security measures, the kind that would eventually become mandatory passenger screening, trace part of their origin directly back to that one Thanksgiving Eve flight. And somewhere between the Seattle airport and the muddy banks of the Columbia River, a man who may or may not have survived the fall became something more durable than a criminal case file. Every year, in the small town of Ariel, Washington, not far from the presumed drop zone, people still gather for something the locals call Cooper Days, part local festival, part unsolved mystery pilgrimage, honoring a man nobody has ever definitively identified for a crime that technically remains, on paper, still open. Somewhere in that cold, dark forest, or somewhere else entirely, D.B. Cooper's story simply stops, mid-sentence, the same way it started. A quiet man in a dark suit, disappearing into the one place investigators could never fully search: the sky.